So while we're waiting for
There you
everyone to
go, on in
sign
the
in, I
background.
just want to welcome everybody to our presentation this afternoon. Um, and I won't do the formal introduction of the speaker, Erin McKean, until a few more minutes, but just want to encourage everyone as they're joining to sign in the chat and tell us where they're coming from. Happy to have everyone here today for our presentation. So again, I'm Laura Murray. I'm the president of the National Museum of Language, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today for our presentation by Erin McKean about Wordnik, the world's biggest online dictionary. And Erin is a graduate of the University of Chicago, where she majored in linguistics, and she's worked in the tech community for quite a few years in various capacities. But for the last several years, she's been, I would say, almost full time working with Wordnik. Is that right, Erin?
No, kind of backwards.
Backwards. Okay.
Full time in tech for a while, working
Okay.
on Wordnik every other waking moment.
Okay. Well, anyway, she's in the tech world, and she's an honorary fellow of the Society for Technical Communication, among her many other hats that she's worn. She's a published author. She's published several books. Two of them are about dresses, The Secret Lives of Dresses and The 100 Dresses. And she's quite a seamstress in her own right. She's written for many well-known publications, including the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and also something called So News, SEW. So it's unusual. Um, but she's here today to talk about her project, Wordnik, to create a dictionary that will have all the words in English in it, uh, including, she says, there's 52% of unique English words that aren't in any dictionary. So it's going to be an unusual presentation, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Erin has to say. And I hope I didn't leave out anything important, Erin, when I made my introduction of you.
Not at all. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I'll go ahead and
And
start
as we
share.
as we get started,
Thank you very much. And thanks to all y'all for being here. As Laura mentioned, I do work on dictionaries, which makes me a lexicographer. And so I like to joke that lexicographer is a word that you'll find in just about every dictionary, no matter how small, because we're lexicographers and we get to decide what words go in. So we might as well put in the word that describes us. And I have worked on dictionaries since 1992. I started working on the Thorndike Barnhart Children's Dictionaries while I was still a student at the University of Chicago. I graduated there with a joint bachelor's and master's degree in linguistics. They used to let you do those together in 4 years, and I don't think they let you do that anymore because I think they lost a lot of money from people not spending an extra year to get the master's degree. And then my most recent traditional dictionary job was I was also the editor-in-chief of American Dictionaries for Oxford University Press, which I left basically in 2007. And so I'm very glad to see you all here today with the intense excitement, which I think is the appropriate emotional state for a talk about dictionaries and on a Saturday afternoon or whatever time it is on Saturday for all y'all. And I do, as Laura pointed out, primarily work on Wordnik. And Wordnik is the dictionary that I founded and that I maintain and that I love. And I also founded and run the Semicolon Appreciation Society. If you want one of these Semicolon Appreciation Society stickers, just email me with your mailing address and I'll be happy to drop one in the mail to you. We send them all over the world, wherever the United States lets us send a first-class letter. But back to Wordnik. So the mission of Wordnik is to, as Lara said, is to find and share all the words of English. And Wordnik actually started on the TED stage. When I was working for OUP, I gave a talk at TED in Monterey in 2007. That talk's online. You can go and take a look at it if you like. And basically, the gist of my talk was how I thought that books were the wrong container. They were the wrong shape, the wrong box to hold the dictionary, to hold the English language. And in the audience for that talk was a man named Roger McNamee, who was an investor, who is an investor still, And he came up to me afterwards and basically said, I agree with you. Let's do something about this problem. And so we talked for about a year. And then Wordnik officially incorporated in 2008 with his backing and with the backing of another investor named Steve Anderson as a venture-backed startup, like full-on Silicon Valley venture-backed startup. And we launched the website in 2009. And then, segue, in 2014, Wordnik became a 501c3 nonprofit because, well, we didn't actually succeed as a venture-backed startup, which requires extreme growth. We grew a lot in words, but not a lot in, say, profits. But luckily, Wordnik's investors were really committed to the idea of Wordnik, to the idea of there being a place for all the words in English. And so they released the intellectual property of Wordnik to me to reform Wordnik as a not-for-profit, which I think was really lovely of them and really lucky for me. So that's kind of a little bit of the history of Wordnik, but I want to spend more time talking about the why of Wordnik. So why all the words? So sometimes when I talk to people about an online dictionary, they think that I'm making something basically that looks like this, right? They think that, oh, it's just text speak and slang and chat speak and whatever language they particularly don't consider to be as worthwhile. But I think it's less and less likely these days for people to think of something online as something being less than. And Wordnik was created really to solve a specific problem that Laura alluded to, which is basically that the majority of the words of the English language aren't in dictionaries. I'm going to give that a second to sink in because sometimes people think, oh, well, the dictionary is language. How could there be more words on the outside than the inside? It's not like a TARDIS. But in fact, there was a study done that was published in the journal Science where they looked at 500 billion words, about 5 million books, about 4% of the books that had ever been published at that time. And they discovered that 52% of the English lexicon, the majority of the words, they called it dark matter. They said it was undocumented in standard references. And they also estimated that English grew by 33% in the 20th century alone. So this paper actually came out several years after Wordnik was founded. And it's really great when science confirms your intuition. So I was like, yes, I know this to be true. I feel this to be true through my work on dictionaries. And then they came out and actually ran the numbers, and the numbers supported my feeling. And so why is this the case? Why are there more words on the outside than the inside? Well, it has to do with how dictionaries are made. And I think because you're at a talk at the Museum of Language on a Saturday, you are probably already fairly familiar with how traditional dictionaries are made. And making dictionaries is time-consuming and expensive. Every word that you want to define takes someone's time. You have to find the data. You have to do the work. And that work is, fairly well paid. And it takes a lot of knowledge and training and effort to do. It is not easy work. And so just to give kind of a quick overview of how dictionary definitions are made, a lexicographer will look at a lot of examples of how words behave in English. And then they will take that information and they will distill it into a definition. So here I have some example sentences. These are all real sentences taken from published works about how the word burl is used. And as an aside, burl also has a few other senses that are not wood related, but we're just going to look at the wood sense of burl right now. And so you can see that here are these kind of rich live sentences, and then they have been condensed, abstracted into these two definitions, right? The outgrowth on a tree and the wood cut from the outgrowth. And it also says, okay, this wood is often used decoratively as a veneer. And this is just for definitions, right? This is not necessarily for doing all the other like apparatus of the dictionary, the pronunciations, the related forms, etymology, usage notes, all the other things that we think about when we think about an entry. But these definitions are very clear, but they're also dry, right? A rounded outgrowth of the definition, that has a different feel than the adjectives tumor-like and nobbled that are in the sentences. And decorative veneer doesn't really give you the sense that you get from reading a bunch of sentences that talk about burl wood, that these objects made for burled wood are often high quality. They're often expensive. But paper dictionaries didn't give you the space to show 25 sentences for each sense so that you could get the flavor of the word as well as its nutritional value, right? I like to say definitions are like vitamins. They have what you need to live, but maybe not the full value that you would get from like ingesting the natural sentence. And, so this work is time consuming and it requires a certain level of expertise. So it's not surprising that only certain words would get this treatment, that lexicographers would look at like the vast array of possible words and decide to maybe focus on words that were used more often, used in more frequent different contexts, so a wider range of use, used more recently rather than a long time ago. And often in English language lexicography, this work is done mostly by people who were white and male. Lexicographers are still probably overwhelmingly white in Western English lexicography. And now this field is diversifying a bit, but because there are so few jobs, we're talking probably low hundreds at best, and turnover is very low because honestly, it's a super fun job. When people get into it, if they like it, they stay. So the turnover is very low. And so diversification of this field is pretty slow. And as we all know, people bring their own biases to their work. And so some of the words selected are because people were more familiar with them because of their personal contexts. So some words were left out, not because necessarily they didn't have a wide range of use, but maybe because that range of use wasn't reflected in the data sources gathered by the dictionary or the lexicographer's personal experience. So we have a situation where dictionaries were associated with prestige, they were expensive, they were produced by people who in the society had prestige, well-educated, relatively well-off, usually white, usually men. And so people started to associate the prestige of the workers and the product with the prestige of the words inside it. We started to think, okay, well, the words in are good and the words out are maybe a little less good. But English is really our shared property, right? Words in and of themselves aren't good or bad. Words in and of themselves aren't important or unimportant. Words are good for certain things, bad for others, right? Slang words are great to make you feel like you belong as part of an in-group, but they're maybe not so good for your dissertation, unless your dissertation's on slang. Never mind. And words are sometimes important to some people and unimportant to others based on what they need them for. And English really belongs to everyone who speaks it. And right now, that's almost 500 million people. English is a shared resource. And sometimes I think it's a shared delusion because like every language is just a group of people agreeing to understand each other. And it's the speakers of English who decide together what words they think are good words and what words they think are bad words. Like if we all agree that petrichor is a lovely word and that rando is a slang word, then that's what those words actually are. Of course, some other languages do have official groups, often called academies, that decide what words are part of the language and which ones aren't. The most famous one, I think, is the Académie Française, and they decide what words are French, and the members of the Academy get a sword, so you know that they're serious about it. I often think that the only reason to start an academy for the English language is to get a really cool sword. But nobody's taken that as a serious suggestion yet, thankfully. Now, this idea that like words are what they're used for is not a new idea. So we've got this obligatory Wittgenstein reference, right? Like the meaning of a word is its use in the language. And even the idea that the best way to show what words mean is through examples is not a new idea. So this is Dean Trench, and he's the guy who came up with the plan for the Oxford English Dictionary. He could be considered the Oxford English Dictionary's first architect. And in 1857, which was about 100 years after Samuel Johnson's dictionary was published, he gave a lecture to the Philological Society, and the lecture was called On Some Deficiencies in Our English Dictionaries. And so basically he was like, let's find quotations and let's make them as rich as possible. Let's let them yield as much information as they can be made to yield. to illustrate the word, not necessarily to tell us about the thing. And let's combine those, right? So that the lexicographer may display eminent skill. So he really thought, like, let's collect a bunch of examples, and then the lexicographer skill will take that further step to distill them into definitions. And so definitions are what we use when we can't show examples. But now we no longer have the limitation of paper. We can always show examples, and we can show really good examples, very like examples trenched with love, I think. And so this is a word I love a lot. It's zemblanity. Zemblanity, as the sentence here says, is the opposite of serendipity, which is the faculty of making unhappy, unlucky, and unexpected discoveries by design. So if you didn't think you needed an antonym of serendipity, I can tell you, in fact, that you do. It's zemblanity. And here you can see on a Wordnik page, like we have 2 example sentences, but we have no traditional definition. And I believe that most people who are fairly fluent in English, having read that second sentence, may not need a definition later in their life. This sentence kind of serves as a definition. The sentences that we find that we think serve best as definitions, we occasionally call free range definitions. They're kind of out there in the world, and we try to collect them. So the Wordnik philosophy is, if a word is in use, it exists, it's a real word, and you don't have to wait for a dictionary definition. An example will do. And there's actually a word about the process of learning from observation and experience. It's one of my favorite words, noogenesis, the acquisition of new knowledge from observation and experience. We do this all the time as human beings. It's probably the primary way that we learn. People learn best from experience, and we can infer relationships between known things. So given enough example sentences, we are our own lexicographers. We intuit the meanings of words. And in fact, most of the words you learned in your life, you probably never looked up, even in this audience who loves language and presumably loves words. You didn't look up the majority of your vocabulary. So learning from example is actually a natural way to learn words. And there are so many fantastic examples because writers are great. Writers like to explain when they know something is not going to be familiar to their audience. So for example, there's a dingulator, a guitar-like instrument made from car parts. This was in a New Yorker article called Is Beekeeping Wrong?, which I highly recommend. It was a great article. A disabled writer wrote about inability, a condition that enables him instead of disables him. And then here's an abbreviation, DISO, D-I-S-O. People who collect those insulated Stanley mugs, they are desperately in search of new ones, of specific ones. And in all of these instances, the person writing about this topic took the time to explain the word that might be unfamiliar. This happens all the time. So often when I kind of reach this point in talking to people about, oh, this is so exciting, there are so many English words, they're everywhere, and we can usually find really good examples that explain what they mean to someone who doesn't actually have to be a lexicographer. Sometimes people say, oh, I'm overwhelmed. Do we really need so many words? Do we really need so many new words? And I like to think that every word is basically a bucket that holds an idea so that you can carry it around more easily. Sometimes you'll see on the internet, especially, lists of words that we consider to be untranslatable. People love these lists, right? One word that I see all the time where English doesn't have like a one-to-one correspondence is the word sandoku, which is a Japanese word that supposedly means, I don't speak Japanese, so I can't tell for sure, the condition of acquiring reading materials, but letting them pile up in your house without reading them. So I think that's a concept that most people are familiar with. If you love books, you probably have more books than you have time to read them, but you keep acquiring more and you just let them pile up. So if you think about it, sandoku is the Japanese bucket to carry this idea around. Now, this does not mean that English speakers can't carry this idea around. It's just like we have to kind of awkwardly hold this idea in our arms, like picking up too many things at the grocery store when you didn't think you needed a basket, but you actually did. Where Japanese has one like handy, convenient bucket. So we have a lot of words that are buckets for kind of more complicated ideas. And having the precise word for something is just more convenient. It's more elegant. I think, it's more fun. And it's kind of like the difference between doing math in Roman numerals and Arabic numerals, right? It's just more efficient to use one system over the other. Now, many of the words that aren't in dictionaries are often like morphological extensions of words that you know. And in fact, Herbert Coleridge, who was one of the very first editors of the Oxford English Dictionary, he had questioned whether dictionaries and lexicographers should really be recording what he called literary fungi. He said these were coinages that were produced by adding prefixes or suffixes, and he thought that these coinages often correlated inversely with the literary rank and standing of the author. So, for example, like the author Thomas Nash had coined the word devilship. Sidney Smith coined the word foolometer. Thomas Carlyle had whiskerage. So Sidney Smith for foolometer, he said he defined it as the acquaintance in society of 3 or 4 regular British fools as a test of public opinion. So if you wanted to know what people thought about something, you'd go consult your foolometer. And I think it's a strength of English that it's so morphologically productive. So occasionally when people say, well, how could there be so many words outside of a traditional dictionary rather than inside? I was like, okay, well, what would happen if you added "un" to the front of every English word that you could possibly add "un" to? That would be a lot more. And so Coleridge thought that these were literary fungi, but I think they're still worth recording because over time, even morphologically created words, which most English words were morphologically created at some point, their meanings can diverge even ever so slightly in tone or feeling from just, the raw edges of the prefix and the root. And so I think we should replace like fear of all these unknowns with curiosity. Like what words could we invent? What words can't we invent? What words are being invented in some far-flung reach where English is spoken or written or just enjoyed that might come to our attention tomorrow or next week or next month or next year? One of the things I love about words is that knowing too many words probably won't do you any harm, at least as far as I know. I mean, I know far too many words and I am in reasonable health. But in addition to giving definitions and many, many, many examples, Wordnik is also a place for opinions about words, because I think an important thing about words in English is how we feel about them. So for example, if you look up a word at the bottom of the page, we'll give you a little stats blurb about the word. So extravaganza, as of yesterday, had been marked as a favorite 4 times. It had 3 comments. And we have it down as not a Scrabble word. We're updating our Scrabble data, so that might be wrong at this point, but it's a little long. And so comments are a way for people to kind of give their opinions about words, which are a big part of how words mean in English. And sometimes they give a little bit more than their opinion. So for example, we had a wonderful Wordnik named Quentin Sullivan. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. We lost him to cancer. He wrote literally thousands of limericks on Wordnik. He wrote a limerick for the word of the day every day. He did this for years. We collected all of them into a PDF that you could download from the Wordnik blog. But every morning I would wake up, and because Quentin was on the East Coast and I'm on the West Coast, I would just get his delightful limerick written in the comments of that word of the day every day. And if the word of the day system was broken, which it not infrequently was, instead of Quentin's limerick, I had an email from Quentin telling me the word of the day was broken and I needed to fix it. I miss him desperately. He was a lovely human. We have another person, another Wordnik now, who loves to make up portmanteaus. So a couple days ago, she posted adventurecation, a portmanteau of adventure and vacation. I have not looked to see if this word exists independently from Natalie's coinage, but it doesn't actually matter. People, if they find this word on Wordnik, they can decide whether they want to share in Natalie's delusion of adventurecation, right? Maybe they'd be like, this is the word I have always been looking for. I always go on adventurecations. Or maybe they can shrug and say, that's not a word for me. But in either case, it doesn't do anybody any harm. Wordnik also allows for people to make lists. So this is another favorite feature of mine. So Wordnik merged with another word site called Wordy. Gosh, a long time ago at this point. We merged with Wordy early on. John McGrath is the founder of Wordy, and he collected just the most delightful group of people who just love to make word lists. Wordy was basically all word lists. And so when Wordnik and Wordy merged, the list making culture of Wordy came into the example loving culture of Wordnik. And I think it just made something much better than the sum of either of those parts. And so frivolous units of measurement. Another great word list that I found the other day is towns and cities that should have been Marx Brothers. So yeah, all these town names do sound like it could be like an unknown 6th or 7th Marx brother out there somewhere. And so Wordnik in general really appeals to the word collector. And one of the joys of collecting is sorting and categorizing. And list making is something that allows people to categorize their words, to sort their words, to group them together, to say, here is my collection. What do you think? And it's something that I really enjoy about the site. One thing that is really wonderful about working on a more collaborative dictionary like Wordnik is that when I worked on traditional dictionaries, once the book had been sent to press and I got it back and I opened it up, if there was something in the book that I didn't know about that surprised me, it was usually a bad surprise. It was usually an error. It was usually a typo. It was something that was not quite right. But every day, Wordnik gives me a surprise, and it's usually a good surprise. Someone looks up a word I didn't know. Someone creates a list that categorizes the English language in a new way. Someone leaves a comment that's delightful, that points me in a direction to find more example sentences. It's really a joyful place to me, and it's one of the reasons that I love working on it. And so Wordnik in general is not a perfect dictionary. We have so much data. Not all of it is as polished as what you would find in a more traditional dictionary. Sometimes we have a weird combination where our traditional definitions come from a more archaic source like Webster's 1913 or the Century Dictionary, and that's mixed with very new examples. Like the ones I like best is when the examples are kind of from lolcat and the Century Dictionary is about like heraldry or something, and there's just a complete disconnect between the traditional definition and the example sentence. But for a lot of words, a lot of the time, it's pretty good. And for a lot of people, it's enough to just find some information about a word because it lets them know that they're not way off base, that this is not just a word-shaped thing, but an actual word. And this information comes to them. It's reassuring to people because it's in a shape that is comforting and familiar. The information about this word is in a dictionary shape because it's not just a search engine result. It's not just a posting on social media. It being in the shape of a dictionary helps reassure people that, yes, this is a word. And if I want to, I can use it in my own vocabulary. And so this is kind of what we want people to feel like when they come to Wordnik. All my favorite words hang out at Wordnik. Not, we want to be all the words, but we also want to be all your favorite words. We want to be a place where you can go find out information about a word, sure, but you might want to stick around and add your own information about words or create your own word collections and sort them. And so, of course, we also take ourselves very seriously, obviously we don't take ourselves very seriously. A big thing I really wanted at the beginning of Wordnik is to move away from the idea of dictionaries as very stuffy and very formal, and to have a place for words that felt, well, really fun and joyful. And that's why we have a heart in our logo. And that's why we try to be friendly. And that's why we try to make it feel like a place that you want to hang out in, like more of a clubhouse and less of a research library. I mean, I love research libraries, but you're not really allowed to have loud, raucous discussions in them. And that's occasionally what happens on Wordnik. So I feel like if English belongs to all of her speakers, then it's not enough to just have all the words. People have to feel like they have a right to all the words. Like it's not just a dusty warehouse for words. It's a community center, and it's a vibrant one. That's what a dictionary should feel like. Okay, so that's why we make Wordnik, and that's what Wordnik is. But I also was going to talk a little bit about how we actually make Wordnik. So it's not easy, but at the same time, it's easier to make a hugely online dictionary than it's ever been. Technologically, what used to take huge teams of people can now be done by basically me part-time. The advent of cloud computing, of open source software, faster and better tools has been nothing short of miraculous. Now, however, an online dictionary is also a lot like the ship of Theseus. I'm constantly replacing parts. We're currently reworking our whole example ingestion pipeline to be a little more sparing in what we ingest. Like, we don't need to have every single example for every word that was ever published anywhere. We just need to have as many good examples as possible for as many different use patterns as we can find. And so, as foreshadowed by me mentioning that Wordnik switched from being a venture-backed startup to a nonprofit, you might have suspected that perhaps the financial side of running a large online dictionary is more difficult than the technical side, and you would be right. So when Wordnik first started years and years ago, pretty shortly afterwards, there was a question on Quora, which is a big Q&A platform, which I'm actually not a huge fan of at this point. It seems to have been taken over by a lot of spam. But somebody asked, how does Wordnik make money? A sheer amount of data and traffic the site has to deal with. What's Wordnik's business model? And so at that point, as a joke, we replied with this image, which was taken from an episode of South Park where there were underpants gnomes. And this was their business model. They were going to collect underpants. Then there was a question mark. And then in phase 3, they would profit. So we have basically been in phase 1 since 2008, collect words. And as a nonprofit, we're lucky we can stay in phase 1. Our mission is actually to be in phase 1 all the time, collect all the words. But we do have to keep the servers running. And so there are lots of ways that people can and have financially supported Wordnik. So one important way that we raise funds is through word adoptions. For $25, you can adopt a word for a year. A few benefactors like Craig Newmark, who adopted the word nerd, adopted their words forever through a Kickstarter that we did back in 2015. So when you adopt a word, this little blurb goes on that words page. It also turns off any ads on that site, on that page for everyone. So if you adopt a word, that word is ad-free for everyone who looks it up. People who log into Wordnik and browse as a logged in user, they also should not see any ads. So we have a lot of words that have been adopted. It's fun to see what words people adopt. And lots of people give words as presents. A couple of years ago, someone gave his wife the word beautiful as a birthday present, which I thought was delightful. People give words that their teachers have taught them as presents, as teacher appreciation presents. Like, if it weren't for you, I would never know this word, which I think is also a lovely thing, and also doesn't need any dusting in your teacher's house and is not shaped like an apple. So I highly recommend it as a teacher appreciation present, even if it didn't support Wordnik. We also offer an API. So an API is a way for one computer to ask another computer for data without a human being involved in the asking part. And so people use our API to get data to do word analysis, to build other tools like domain name finding tools, or to embed dictionary content into their own sites. A lot of people use our word of the day API to get our word of the day every day. And then they display it on a display called a magic mirror, or they display it on a display in a school for a word of the day, which I find very interesting. A lot of students use our API to learn programming, because if you're learning about APIs, it helps if the data being delivered through the API has a kind of flavor and shape that you're familiar with. So most students are familiar with dictionaries. So the data that comes through the API is familiar to them. So they only have to concentrate on learning how to use an API itself. And so actually one of the ways that we support Wordnik is that if you request a key, our free plan is free, but if you request a free key, it takes 7 days to get your key, unless you make what we call an impatience donation of $5. So students who have put off their assignments too long will often pay us $5 to get their key right away because they didn't plan ahead, and so they weren't able to get their key in time to complete their assignment. So I personally find it hilarious that we can monetize impatience and procrastination because it's so rare that you can actually do that in the world. We also have a data set that we license to word game developers who can then embed dictionary definitions right into their game, which means the game doesn't have to be connected to the internet in order to see a definition for a word that you might want to play. So one of these games is Not Words. If you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. It is very fun and it's very charming. And they're Not Words players are very engaged with the game. They often email me if they have a problem with the game because they just want to cover all their bases. Like they see Wordnik's name in the game attached to the dictionary definitions, and then they see the Not Word creator's name. So they're like, I'm just going to email everybody because I definitely need to play Not Words right now and I can't. So we're also, as a 501(c) nonprofit, supported by a lot of other companies who provide free or reduced cost services for some of the technical infrastructure that we use to run the site. So as a nonprofit, we get significant support from tech companies like New Relic, Elastic Cloud, Mailchimp, Slack, Stripe, and others, as well as other discounts specifically for nonprofits through TechSoup, which is an organization that provides technology to nonprofits. And so because we benefit from these nonprofit discounts, we also maintain a list of companies that provide discounts to nonprofits for tech products on GitHub. And we receive matching funds for corporate donations through Benevity. So if you just want to make a direct donation to Wordnik, check with your employer to see if they do matching funds. We're registered with Benevity so that we're on the official list of things that you can donate to and have your company match your donation. Whew, that was a lot. But mostly Wordnik runs on me. I spend the majority of my free time on it. I also have a full-time job. This is the point where I need to make a disclaimer that I am also employed by Google. I work in their open source programs office, helping open source projects have better documentation. Google does not support Wordnik. All of my Wordnik work is completely separate from my Google work. They gave me specific permission to work on Wordnik in my non-Google time. And I really appreciate that because it's nice to like have a job and things like health insurance and still get to work on Wordnik in my free time. So I think about Wordnik as like running a small community theater group, right? Like I do it out of love. It provides a benefit for a larger community. I'm always looking to find ways for people to support it. And I hope it goes on after I'm gone. That's actually my main goal. With Wordnik is to get it in such a shape that at any point I want to retire, it's a turnkey operation that I can hand over to the next Dread Pirate Roberts. And but at the same time, I'm also luckier than most lexicographers who have ever lived. So for example, I didn't have to labor for 20 years before the first person was able to use Wordnik the way that many editors on the OED had to, right? I don't have to print it in fascicles. People aren't waiting for me to finish the back half of the letter P. And since dictionaries are never done, I always have something new and interesting to work on. So I feel like in the last, say, 300 years, dictionaries were from projects that one person who was kind of a crank worked on by themselves or with a small group of people. And then for like 150 years or so, it was like a fine middle-class occupation. And then the economics of making dictionaries just totally crashed with the death of the print book. And now, sure, there are a few nice middle-class jobs in dictionaries still, but also a lot of single people who are kind of cranks working on their own projects. And so I feel that that's lucky because dictionary work it's just delightful work. It is the kind of thing that you do, even if you're not really being paid for it. And in fact, J.R. Holder, he worked on the Dictionary of American English. And he said that he knows of no more enjoyable intellectual activity than working on a dictionary. It doesn't make you anxious. It doesn't like build up your hopes only to have them collapse. Every day you have new problems, but they're small and interesting problems. And at the end of the day, you feel healthily tired and you have advanced the whole work towards its completion. And that is, it's just lovely. And it's true. Everything I work on with Wordnik, it's not a world-shaking problem. It's not a life or death problem, but they're absorbingly interesting problems. And it's worthwhile work. And every day I can advance the dream of having all the words a little bit more towards its completion. It is kind of a Zeno's turtle kind of thing. We're never going to get to all the words. There's never going to be one point where we can say, oh, we're done. But we could keep moving in that direction. I like working on Wordnik so much that I even like answering the customer service email. I like answering emails from confused students. I like answering emails from people who have a new word that they want to share with me. I believe all feedback is a gift. I love answering the emails from people who've noticed something broken. And I'm like, yes, that is broken. Thank you for letting me know. Let me send you some Wordnik stickers as a thank you. Because when people care enough to tell you if something's broken, that means you've made something that's useful to them. If it wasn't useful to them, they wouldn't care if it was broken or not. So in addition to sending me notes when you find something that's broken, there are other ways to help Wordnik if you'd like to. So for example, you can become an active user of Wordnik.com. By actively using the site, you're more likely to notice if something is broken, and then you can tell me, and that's a big help. If you use the site not logged in, you'll get some ads served to you, unless you're using an ad blocker. That helps support the site financially. You can support the site financially by adopting a word. You can also help us by collecting citations, although we do try to do more automated collecting of examples and citations. We know that people who are voracious readers who read across a wide range of publications are likely to notice new words or new uses of words or just overlooked words. And so we use the online annotation tool Hypothesis. It's an open source tool. You can use it for free. And you can basically install a little bookmarklet in your web browser and highlight a sentence on almost any web page. And then you can annotate that sentence with tags like, hey, Wordnik, look at this. And we use some specific tags that are a little more concise than, hey, Wordnik, look at this. And add other information to the citation like, oh, this is actually an etymological citation, or this citation tells you how to pronounce this word. We find that people who like to do this really like to do this. So if this sounds like something you would like to spend your time doing while you browse the web, you can absolutely sign up. The instructions are right there. And I finished a little bit early because I feel like the most fun part of any of these talks, selfishly for me, are the questions. And I know that we wanted to take a little bit of a stretch break as well. So I'm happy to take a few questions now and then go to a stretch break. Or Jill, if you wanted to do stretching now and then come back for questions, just let me know. But thanks so much for your attention, y'all, today. And I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you. So yeah, we generally stop about this time to stretch. We have 20 people here. Does anybody have a question that you'd like to ask? You can unmute or type it in the chat.
Yeah, I have a question if everyone can hear me.
Okay.
Erin, this is a really fascinating topic, and I'm the kind of thing I'm interested in. I know that's not a question, but one thing I do have a question about is is these words that you're accumulating from various sources. Is there a copyright involved here? The reason I'm bringing this up is because you have a program where people can adopt a word, and they pay $25, I think is what you said.
Mm-hmm.
That tells me that you should have ownership of the word. Otherwise, there's some legal things here, I imagine. So what's your response to that? I'm kind of curious.
My first response is I am not a lawyer and this should not be construed as legal advice. But I am an intellectual property enthusiast. And if there was like a trademark fantasy football league, I would absolutely have a team. So you cannot own a word. You can own a trademark, which is, again, not a lawyer, the application of that word in a particular context, which is why you can have Apple Music and Apple Computers. There was a big trademark fight over that when Apple Computing got into music. The arrangement of words can be copyrighted in many circumstances, but a single word or even a string of words like a title can't be copyrighted. So really you can think of adopting a word as being a fan of that word. So it's kind of like you bought that word's like official jersey in that word's sports league, and you're showing everybody that you're the biggest possible fan of that word. So yeah, copyright is very interesting. And I thought you were going to ask, like, how are we able to show all these examples as copyright? And I'd be like, well, that's fair use. There's a long tradition of examples being fair use in dictionary making. And I know people are talking a lot, especially with all the training of large language models at this point, about what exactly is fair use. And if those large language models mess up large scale language corpora for dictionaries, I'm going to be the maddest person that has ever been mad. So I hope that answered your question. So the answer is nope, you can't copyright a word. You could trademark it. Surprisingly, though, we have very few people who own a trademark who adopt that word as a trademark, which I think they should, because it would be a really great way to mark a word as a trademark. But one of the many things on my like infinitely long to-do list is to send out a mailer to trademark defense lawyers and say, hey, I've got this brand new way you can defend your trademark. Wouldn't you like to do it? It's only $25. So.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Victor has a question in the chat. He'd like to know how you deal with slang words and regional words from a specific dialect of English.
Victor, that is a great question. So basically, everybody is welcome to join, and we try where possible to make it clear from context when something is slang or regional. Like oftentimes it will be in the sentence. So for example, slang words tend to hang out with other slang words. So unless an author is doing it for deliberate humorous effect, they won't necessarily throw a slang word into the middle of a sentence where the rest of the word and the syntax is very elevated or very high standard English. We could do better about labeling things, especially for regionalisms. Like sometimes you really have to like dig deep into the context to understand whether a word is a regionalism or not. Like, so you see an example, and if it doesn't absolutely mention like a place, you might have to look at the link to that example and be like, oh, wait, this is from like a small local newspaper. It's more than likely that this word is a regionalism if it's something that doesn't seem to have a lot of examples in other places. The interesting thing is that, especially in the United States, English language speakers are so mobile now. Americans in general are more mobile that, I'm originally from North Carolina. And so I use a lot of Southernisms. My husband's from Milwaukee. You will take the word bubbler from his cold, dead fingers. A bubbler is another word for drinking fountain. But we live in the Pacific Northwest right now, and we're not going to give up those words that we like from our original dialects just because we're in a place that doesn't use bubbler or y'all. So I'm afraid that's not a very good answer to your question about how we deal with them. I think the they don't get any special treatment. They don't get any special maltreatment. They just are there. And we're working on ways to make it easier to highlight when words might not be part of standard English or when words might be restricted to a particular region.
And you could always look up the word in the Dictionary of American Regional English to see where it's from.
Yeah, DARE is a great resource. You might have to go through your library because it's because
they're one of our
paywalled.
partners. Yeah.
Yeah, I was an advisor to them for a while, and it was the most fun.
Emily, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, I'd love to. So I was wondering, do you ever decide not to add a word that's been suggested or submitted to Wordnik? And essentially, what criteria do you use in determining what is or isn't an appropriate addition when your goal is to include all the words, but then that kind of begs the question of, well, what might not actually qualify as a word or an appropriate word for Wordnik?
We don't actually gate anything in advance. So you could look up any string or emojis, all sorts of things. You can look up a bunch of characters and you can leave a comment, and that will add that word permanently to our database, and it will be lookupable by everybody forever afterwards.
Great.
Occasionally, we will remove those comments if they are obviously spam. They link off to a third-party website. We've gotten into a little bit of a tricky thing in the last couple of weeks where there have been a lot of comments added by one user where the comments seem to be generated by a large language model. So I've reached out to the user for some clarification, but if I don't get any clarification, we might remove them because we really are interested in how English is used by English speakers, and I don't believe that an LLM qualifies as an English speaker. And so yeah, that's and but the thing is like if there were, say, sentient aliens, just as a thought experiment, who wanted to create words in English, like maybe that was their hobby, they'd go from planet to planet learning the indigenous languages of that planet and creating new words for them, I would 100% include those words, but not LLMs.
Great, thank you.
And for the audience, LLMs is another way of saying an AI, like a chatbot.
Yeah, I'm kind of a nerd about this, and I don't like to use the word AI because I feel like that word has too much science fictional weight. Like if you say AI, you think about agency, you think about sentience, you think about killer robots. But a large language model is basically like it's a statistical model of how words work, which would make you think they'd be great for dictionaries, and we're still testing that.
Yeah, and Ray has a question about presenting to school children. Ray, would you like to ask the question?
Well, it's very kind of you to say that I have good energy. I have done a TEDx youth talk about how to make up words that's intended for people who are not necessarily like able to legally vote or drink or drive. And I really enjoy getting emails from teachers where their classes all decided to come together and make up a word, and they often get their words added to Wordnik, and then I send them stickers. That's really fun for me. My TED Talks have actually been included in some of the classwork for lexicography and terminology classwork for university students in South Korea. When I was in South Korea this summer, I was asked to take way more selfies than I normally am because all of the students I met had seen my online talks. Like I'm not usually like asked to take a selfie if I need with anybody ever, but in South Korea I was, which was pretty fun. I think also
Laura has a question. Yeah.
So English, the question is, how do we handle words based on foreign words that are used in English in a slightly modified form? And, English has a long tradition of looting and pillaging other languages for as many words as we possibly can, especially like delicious words like food words. And so if a word is used in an English language context, even if it's about something that is, even if that word is not English, like for example, there was a big article in the New York Times last week about various kinds of Korean cookies, like yakgwa, I think was one of the cookies. So we would enter that sentence for the word yakgwa, which explains what kind of cookie it is. Because once it's in the New York Times, that might be a reasonable signal of that term having an extended life in English. And we can think of so many food words where they were once like unusual exotic delicacies, and now we just eat them every day. And so food words in particular, just, yeah, let's go ahead and add them. But if English language speakers are using a word in an English language context, that actually means that other English language speakers might be curious about that word and want to go look it up and see how other, like, even more English language speakers are using that word. So yeah, we lean, as you might have figured out by now, we definitely lean towards inclusion rather than exclusion, because we kind of have a lot of space. We don't have to, as the kids say, gatekeep things. We can just let everything in and let the user, we can trust the user to understand enough from context to make the decision about what they want to include in their own language for themselves.
Yeah, when I asked that question, I was thinking about a case we had here at the museum when we had a Spanish language poem that we posted on our website, an original poem. And in the poem, it's referred to a woman, an indigenous woman in Mexico, who was taken as a consort by the Spanish conquistador, and she goes by, in Spanish, she goes by the name La Chingada, and La Chingada in Spanish actually means someone who has been raped. But instead of using her name, they call her La Chingada. Well, somehow that word has, I found out from people who lived in the Southwest, come down into Southwestern sort of Spanglish or whatever you might want to call it. And they use it in a kind of gross way. They say, I've been chingered up, like, that I've been fucked up. I mean, it's really weird, but it's used in an American context by people in the Southwest. A lot of people are familiar with that usage of it. So it's kind of an odd thing. I don't know if that's something that you'd even be interested in for your dictionary, or is it just too oddball?
If we had an example of it, we'd include it. I don't think it would make the link. Etymology is where this kind of process really falls down. Like etymology is really very skilled work, and it's not easy for what's basically jumped up database analysis to make these connections between a root form in one language and an anglicized form in English. But that happens a lot. Like I would say that a disparaging term in one language is often brought into another language as a even more disparaging term, maybe. And so Greg had also asked about profanity, new profanity. I feel like Wordnik does not get as many people looking up profanity because the Urban Dictionary exists. Like they're kind of the locus. They have that energy. And I think it's fine that, we wouldn't block people from adding examples about new profanities that they have found. We would delete comments that were disparaging of a particular person. But if they were like well motivated linguistically, we would absolutely allow for that. I'm really happy that the Urban Dictionary exists because I think, Wordnik is really focused on written English. We just don't have the capacity to do analysis of spoken English, even though there's like 1 quadrillion hours of video at this point that could possibly be analyzed. So I feel like Urban Dictionary does a much better job of representing how people speak, which often, includes profanity. If that helps, like I would say like a lot of the categories that we put words into, right? Slang, neologism, vulgar, obscene, profanity, loan word, foreignism, borrowing. Like these are facets of English. And in print dictionaries, they were used as often ways to like narrow the problem scope, right? Because you only have so much room. So you can say, okay, well, if we say we don't treat foreignisms, we could just stop looking at that category of words and have like a line when a foreignism crosses some particular line, I don't know, 50 uses in a major English language publication in the last 5 years. Okay, now it's English, right? But these are all like heuristics used to reduce the scope of work. They're not used to reduce the language. It's still the language. So with Wordnik, we can use those labels as facets, but not as gates, right? And we're working to try to make the faceting better. I'm sorry, I've kind of like ranted a little bit on some of these answers, Jill. I don't know if you want to do the stretch break.
Yeah. So Dan has a question he'd like to ask.
Oh, I see Dan's question. Does a word from another language have to have a spelling with Latin characters in order to qualify as a loan?
He was going to unmute.
Oh, yeah, Dan, let's hear it in your own words.
Well, no, I mean, it's fine. I was just kind of curious, like the extent to which, characters or diacritics that are sort of not native to English, whatever that means, right? Could be in a loan word, because like it's hard for me to imagine something calling itself an English dictionary having, a word in like a Japanese script, but not so hard to imagine, a word having diacritics that we really only tend to use for Spanish words or French Spanish loan words or French loan words or or that kind of thing. So I'm kind of curious where you would see the line. I mean, you said that in Wordnik you allow emoji. I'm guessing that means you kind of allow probably all of Unicode. And so I'm wondering, like, what does that mean if somebody puts in a loan word, but they put it in like a non-English script? Does that what do you do with that?
We do accept all Unicode. We have had people make lists where all of the entries in the list are in Chinese or Japanese or all emoji, Cyrillic, diacriticals that aren't typically used on English words. And we basically like just keep a little bit of an eye on it, because if it's not really harming anyone, we are just like, fine, you wanted to make a list. It's got 25 words, it's got 25 entries and they're all Japanese. Fine. But we don't deliberately collect any data for those words. And we would probably remove comments. We actually do remove comments if the comments are all non-English. We get, for some weird reason, we get a lot of Vietnamese spam. Like if you want to buy a used car in Vietnam, or like get your house re-roofed, like for some reason they think people are coming to Wordnik to find that kind of information. So we delete that pretty fast. So we have a pretty low tolerance policy for comments in other languages and other writing systems. But one-off word lookups or even short lists, we're just like, if this helps Wordnik help you, that's fine. We have had people adopt emoji, which I think is pretty cool.
All right, thanks.
No worries. And it looks like we have another question from Greg about standardizing spelling.
Yes, I'm wondering, I think I know the answer already, that you pretty much just, when someone sends an entry in, you accept the spelling that they have. You're not going to change it. For example, BECAUSC, because, you'll often see that CAUSC just spelled CUZ, people taking a shortcut. What is it? Would you have a policy towards that? I assume you just leave it as is.
So there's a large community of very helpful Wordniks who, if they see someone leave a comment on a word and it's very clear that the person is leaving the comment and that they are confused about where the comment should actually be, they will often get a reply saying, oh, Wordnik actually has an entry for this. It's over here, which I think is just very kind of them. If people enter in words that are kind of like an I dialect spelling or slangy respelling, then that's also usually fairly clear from context. We haven't done a lot of work rationalizing spelling because there is no rationalizing spelling in English. There's just too much everywhere all the time. But luckily our friends at Wiktionary, they have included entries for most major misspellings. So if you look up a misspelling for most words, there will be a Wiktionary definition that will direct you to the correct spelling. We'd like to do some kind of tricky things with like Levenstein distances and fuzzy matching, but that hasn't made it to the top of the to-do list yet.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I've put a link in the chat for the poem that Laura was referring to. This was written by a poet who is in Philadelphia. About the Mexican diaspora. Paisajado. And one of the words that came to mind in reference to Dan's question about diacritics is the word cafe. It always, has the accent mark on the E, even though it's in English, So.
Right, and our friends of the New Yorker, their fondness for cooperate.
Oh yeah, with the little.
Yeah, and resume versus resume. One of the great things is that about working on a project like this is that there's no shortage of interesting things you could do with the data. And so we do have a lot of data, and we could absolutely get more that looked at, say, the relative distribution of, say, cooperate with and without the diaresis and resume with and without the diacriticals. But interestingly enough, like when Worknik first started, a lot of the large language corpora were not as accessible as they are today. And so now there are many more tools that can answer those questions for you or to help you find the answer. Like, for example, there's a great tool called Sketch Engine. The BYU corpus can help you with some of these questions. And when Wordnik reincorporated as a nonprofit, we were like, okay, well, we can't be all things to all people, even if we would like to. So this kind of statistical data about the words of English is something that we can't do as much of as we might like to do or be interested in doing. And other tools exist, and we're really just going to focus as much as we can on trying to collect as many examples of English word usage as possible and keep the site and the API up and running. But I would definitely suggest that people look into some of the other kind of more computational linguistics tools that do exist, because these questions are fascinating. And it's easier and easier now to build your own data set. Like you can look at the Common Crawl. You can build your own corpora using tools like Sketch Engine, or just building it yourself, from all the Lego blocks of computation that are out there. I mean, as Laura said at the beginning, I'm trained as a linguist. I'm not trained in computer science. I took one computer science class in college, and I took it deliberately so that I could not take calculus. So it was less like a movement towards computers and more of a movement away from higher mathematics. And I would say that if you love language, computer languages are just another language. And it is so much easier to learn JavaScript than it is to learn, say, German. And I'm saying this from personal experience. I have learned both, and JavaScript is way easier. It has a vastly smaller vocabulary. It has a much more regular syntax. And, if you think of language in its purely instrumental use as a way to communicate between people, a computer language is just a way to communicate with a computer. And a computer doesn't really ever get like hungry or hangry or sleepy or just having a bad day. Like when you talk to a computer, it's always receptive. You just have to frame it in the right way. So if you're interested in these questions of language and you think, well, I can't do that because I'm not a programmer, I'm not a data scientist, you could be. You're just not one yet. And it's not as hard as people think to get to that place. The tools are really good now. So sorry, that's my little rant about, like, if you're really interested, like, go start playing around, because it's fun and it's not as hard as you think.
And there's a lot of people out there having fun with words.
That's what words are for.
One of the things I look forward to every December and January are the word of the year announcements by the different dictionaries and the American Dialect Society.
Oh yeah, one of Wordnik's board members, Bree Hughes, is one of the people who works on Among the New Words for the American Dialect Society. And she posts a lot of comments on Wordnik of new things that she's found during her research, which is always lovely.
Hugo commented in the Wordnik in the chat. The Wordnik API is fun to use too. Hugo, do you want to elaborate on how you use it? Some folks who are watching may not know what an API is. So do you have the ability to ask your question or talk about it orally?
Oh, Hugo says he's used it for Twitter bots. Yeah, a lot of great Twitter bots have used the Wordnik API. And for November is so NaNoWriMo, right? November is National Novel Writing Month, and NaNoGenMo is National Novel Generation Month, where you write a computer program to generate text in like the length and shape of a novel. Oh. And those I think those are really fun. There's like a text, there are a couple textual artists. I'm not quite sure what else to call them, like Darius Kazemi, and oh, shoot, I'm blanking on her name. It'll come to me in a second. Who make really delightful generated text. Oh, thank you, Hugo. Alison Parrish. That's exactly who I was thinking of. Her work is wonderful to look at. I highly recommend if you're interested in the intersection of like generativity and language. Darius has used the Wordnik bot before to do something like he built a random Amazon shopper that would just buy him stuff randomly from Amazon, and like one of the first things the bot bought him was like a book on linguistics, which I thought was hysterical. But yeah, I'm always surprised and kind of delighted and gratified what people use the Wordnik API for. And it's nice to know that kind of the means of production of making word-driven things are easier to get these days than they used to be. Oh, and Mark asked about what about things like gonna or wanna. Are those words or pronunciations of going to and want to? So kind of both, right? So because English spelling is barely within shouting distance of English pronunciation sometimes, we often want to represent in writing the way words meet the ear. And so we have these idialect spellings. And I think it's really hard to say, like, when does something become a word? And my position is, of course, the extreme maximalist position, which is if it's used as a word, it's a word. So I would say that gonna and going to are different lexical items because they have different uses, right? So when you write gonna, you have a goal in mind, and your goal is to communicate informality or to make sure that the way the word is said has prominence in your writing over the more formal form, right? Like if you don't care whether when someone reads that sentence, they hear in their head gonna or going to, then you would probably just write going to. So I would absolutely give them word status if I were the arbiter of what's a word and what's not a word. But the whole point of Wordnik is that I don't want to be the arbiter of what's a word and what's not a word. I just want to have a place where all the information about all things that even could possibly be words is in one place and give people the tools to decide for themselves. Because I feel like at the end of the day, the question is not, is this a word? The question is, do you, as a speaker, want to use this as a word? And in what context and when? It's kind of like if I showed you, let's like imagine something that has a handle and a surface and a bunch of like little knobbly bits on it. And if I showed it to you and I said, this is a tool, you wouldn't say, I don't think that's a tool. You would say, oh, I don't know what I would use that for. What kind of tool is it? Right? It's the same thing with a word, right? A word is a tool to express an idea or to create a feeling or to build a communication with someone. And you don't say, well, I don't think that's a word. You say, I don't have a use for that. That doesn't belong in my personal toolbox of language. And sometimes when I give a talk like this, I show a picture of actually a fairly rare tool. It's like a little metal bit and it's got some cutouts in it. And mostly people don't know what it is. But it's a tool called a button polish shield. And you put them under your metal buttons on your jacket so that you can polish your buttons with metal polish and not get any of the polish on the actual cloth. So it saves you from having to take the buttons off the garment, polish them, and then sew them back on. And if people don't recognize that and what it's for, they don't say that's not a tool. They say, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that's for. And I really wish people would do that with words. I really wish they would look at something and be like, I don't know what that's for. And maybe it's not for anything. Like maybe the thing that I showed you doesn't actually have a use. Maybe it's like an art object, right? And you have, but is that necessarily like not a tool if it's shaped like a tool? You kind of get into like very philosophical questions. Epistemology. I feel like everything comes down to epistemology at the end. Well, here's a much more practical question. So Laura wants to know if we have evidence that teachers of English to non-native speakers are using Wordnik to help their students. That's a good question. Yes, I have gotten email from teachers who like Wordnik because of the examples, because it helps them show examples of words in use to their students. Sometimes whole classes make lists of words that they want to learn together. Wordnik's not really intended for people under the age of 13 because of US laws about children and the internet. So we discourage use by people under 13. Like you should have your parents' permission. You can't create an account if you're under 13. We ask you not to. But in general, like a lot of the people who teach English to non-English speakers use pretty strict curricula as part of their programs. And I'm not sure that Wordnik is part of any of these language teaching programs at this point. I'm pretty much happy to talk about Wordnik like until the heat death of the universe. So happy to answer more questions. If you get bored of hearing about words, I can talk about sewing. Oh, do I know of similar efforts in other languages? So I have had people reach out to me who want to build a Wordnik for their languages. And especially for Spanish, because, you know, of course, one of the problems of doing this kind of data-driven approach to lexicography is that there are many, many languages in the world that are under-resourced digitally, right? There's not large online corpora. There are not a lot of, you know, regular publications that are available digitally that you can do this with. I haven't seen anything. Oh, there was one dictionary in French. I have to figure out where it went. I haven't seen it for a while. Last time I checked, it was offline. But not only did they like take the Wordnik model, but they actually copied the entire design of the site. Like they just like downloaded all the CSS and HTML from the site and just used that for their dictionary. And I was like, at first I was a little like, especially because they didn't actually clean up the CSS, so there was still like the word Wordnik in the source code of their site. But I realized that people were probably not going to confuse that site with Wordnik, and it wasn't really worth it to try to track them down. They were a pretty anonymous site, like they didn't have any information about the people behind them, and it would have been a lot of hassle to like try to get their domain name registrar to send them a cease and desist, that kind of stuff. So we decided it just wasn't worth the effort. At some point, we actually want to open source the framework of the site. We don't the data itself is kind of less easy to open source for a bunch of reasons. But just having a way for people to like plug in their own data and making a site like Wordnik, I would love for that to happen. But again, it's one of the things on the infinite to-do list that hasn't made it to the top of the list yet.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
Lara
Well,
said that
I think looks like that's all the questions that we have.
Thank you all so much for spending this time with me today. And thank you to the folks whose names I recognize. Any attendees, you know who you are. A couple of word adopters in there as well. So thank you again. And you can always reach me at Erin at Wordnik. I answer all your calls in the order they were received. But I do love hearing from Wordniks and people who would like to use Wordnik. And so thank you again for spending this time with me and listening to me rant about Wordnik. I really appreciate it.
Rebecca says it's the first that she's heard of it.
Sometimes I joke that Wordnik is the biggest English language dictionary that nobody's ever heard of. So
kind of like our museum.
You know, and I feel like, you know, today when you feel like everything is just so often ubiquitous, right? Like there'll be a trend and then suddenly it's everywhere, especially if it's related to Taylor Swift, Long May She Reign. But like sometimes it feels good to find something that's, you know, a little bit out of the beaten path.
Yeah. Special. Thanks again, Erin. Thanks
You're
to
very
everybody
welcome. Thank you.
Today.
And I just want to say on behalf of the museum, it was really a pleasure to have this opportunity to listen to you tell us about Wordnik. It's an amazing project, and thank you for sharing time with us. And we will be recording your talk, so I'm sure